Most people think avoidants never chase, but that's the biggest misunderstanding. Avoidants do initiate, just not for the reasons you think. They don't chase intensity, fireworks, or emotional adrenaline the way anxious hearts do. They chase something quieter, something calmer, something they've spent most of their life trying to protect, emotional safety disguised as freedom. And when an avoidant finally steps forward, when they initiate, when they take the lead, it's never random. It's never impulsive. It's a response to something specific inside them, finally settling, finally relaxing, finally believing maybe this person isn't a threat to my peace. Avoidance move toward you when your presence feels like a soft place instead of a demand. When you aren't waiting by the phone for their every message. When you aren't asking them to rush toward a level of closeness they don't yet feel prepared for. Your calm becomes the oxygen their nervous system didn't know it needed. The less you push, the more they open. The more you release pressure, the more they gravitate back. It's a paradox. The act of giving them space is what makes them move closer. That's when their walls loosen, not in dramatic leaps, but in subtle shifts. A quicker reply, a deeper question, a moment of vulnerability that feels accidental but is anything but. They initiate when they feel understood instead of analyzed, not avoidance. When the second they sense you're studying them, diagnosing them, or trying to figure out how to make them open up. But when they feel seen without being dissected, accepted without being demanded from, something inside them softens. You become the first person who doesn't make their emotional defenses feel like a flaw, and that alone can trigger them to take the lead. It's not enthusiasm, it's relief. It's the rare moment when they don't feel the need to protect themselves from you. Avoidance step forward when your boundaries are calm, consistent, and not weaponized. When you communicate your needs without panic, without emotional chaos, without ultimatums. They've learned to brace themselves for explosive reactions or emotional spirals, so your steadiness feels foreign and strangely comforting. It challenges their belief that closeness only leads to conflict. For the first time, they're not preparing for a battle, they're preparing for a connection. And that sense of emotional safety makes them want to lead instead of hide. Most importantly, avoidants initiate when they realize they have the freedom to come closer without losing themselves. Freedom is their native language. Freedom is their version of love. When you give them space to breathe, think, process, and return on their own terms, you trigger their desire to reconnect. It creates a kind of internal pull they can't ignore, not because they're afraid of losing you, but because they feel safe enough to choose you. And that's the truth. And no one talks about. Avoidants don't move toward pressure. They move toward peace. They don't chase intensity. They chase the rare person who feels safe enough to step toward, even when their nature tells them to run. Avoidants pull back the second they feel someone trying to win them, impress them, or earn their approval. It triggers their oldest fear, the fear of being responsible for someone else's emotional world. So they retreat not because they don't care, but because they feel the weight of expectations pressing against their chest. But everything changes the moment you stop proving yourself and start simply being yourself, when you stop performing. When you stop over-explaining, when you stop trying to be the ideal partner, they'll never leave. And instead, you show up in your own calm, grounded energy. That shift is seismic for an avoidant, even if they'll never say it out loud. Because that calm presence creates a contrast they aren't used to. You're not chasing, you're not begging, you're not anxiously decoding their every micro behavior. You're just there, steady and centered, not making their reactions responsible for your worth. To an avoidant, that feels like emotional safety. And emotional safety, not intensity, not chaos, not romance movies, is the true spark that makes an avoidant lean in. It makes them think something they almost never think in relationships. I don't have to protect myself from this. That thought doesn't come loudly. It arrives quietly, almost like a whisper beneath their defenses. It isn't dramatic, it's gentle, but inside their nervous system, it's transformative. Suddenly, they don't feel monitored, they don't feel evaluated, they don't feel pressured to perform or maintain a version of themselves that feels good enough. They can exhale in your presence, and that's when their behavior begins to shift in ways most people overlook. Avoidants don't initiate in big, sweeping romantic gestures. They initiate in subtle moments, the kind you might miss if you're only looking for grand efforts. A slightly faster reply, a message that appears without you prompting anything. A small check in, how's your day? A curious question about something you mentioned days ago. These may look insignificant to someone used to constant reassurance, but to an avoidant, these small openings are huge. They are invitations, risk-taking moments, emotional bids that they only offer when they feel safe enough to let someone into their inner world. The more you stay grounded in your authenticity, the more those openings grow, because avoidants aren't scared of closeness. They're scared of losing themselves inside it. When you show them you won't abandon your identity just to impress them, they finally feel free to keep theirs. That's what draws them in. Not the performance, not the chase, not the need to be chosen, but the quiet confidence that says, I am enough as I am, and you are free to stay or free to go. That energy is magnetic to an avoidant. They crave people who hold themselves with that kind of self-respect because it tells them something essential. They won't be swallowed by your needs. Over time, this creates a rhythm they can trust. You're consistent, but not smothering. You're warm, but not demanding. You're present, but not fused. In that space, an avoidant begins to show up in their own way, not because they feel obligated, but because they genuinely want to. It's the desire to connect without sacrificing themselves. It's the kind of connection they rarely experience because so few people can maintain that level of emotional neutrality. And that's the secret. Avoidants don't start opening when you chase them. They start opening when you show them they can be close to you without disappearing inside the relationship. When you stop proving yourself and start being yourself, you become safe. And when you become safe, they step forward, not loudly, not dramatically, but intentionally and consistently. Most people panic in an avoidance quiet. They feel the pause, the space, the shift in energy, and immediately assume something is wrong. They rush in with questions, reassurance seeking, rapid fire messages, anything to fill the silence before it expands into something unbearable. But you don't collapse into anxiety. You don't interpret their quiet as rejection. You don't chase their attention like it's slipping through your fingers. Instead, you do something almost no one ever does for an avoidant. You let their silence breathe. You don't rush to fix it. You don't demand clarity. You don't assume their pulling back is personal. You understand that silence for an avoidant isn't punishment, it's processing. It's how they regulate their emotions. It's how they find their footing again in moments where closeness begins to feel overwhelming. And instead of taking that personally, you give them what their nervous system is silently begging for: space without consequences. You let them think. You let them recalibrate. You let them sit inside their own mind long enough to distinguish fear from reality. Avoidants aren't used to that type of emotional realm. Their entire life has conditioned them to expect that the moment they step back, someone will step forward too fast, too intensely, too anxiously. They're used to being pulled back into the emotional arena before they're ready. So when you don't do that, when you stay steady instead of panicked, it hits them differently. It hits them like oxygen, like the first deep breath after weeks of holding their chest tight, like relief they didn't know they needed but instantly recognize. And that freedom does something powerful inside them. It dismantles the fear they've carried since childhood, the fear of being engulfed, consumed, emotionally cornered. It shows them a truth they rarely experience. Closeness with you doesn't cost them their sense of self. They can pull back without the relationship collapsing. They can disappear into their quiet without you turning it into a crisis. They can exist in their own internal world without losing their place in yours. And because you don't pressure them, something paradoxical happens. They start to feel safe in a way they're almost never safe with anyone. They start to feel like they can come back, not because you demanded it, but because they want to. Avoidance don't return to pressure. They return to peace. They return to emotional environments where their distance isn't punished. They return to people who trust the connection enough to let it breathe. So where most people push, you pause. Where most people fear the quiet, you respect it. Where most people assume abandonment, you assume autonomy. That level of calm changes everything for an avoidant. It communicates something more powerful than reassurance. It communicates stability. It tells them that your emotional world isn't dependent on their constant engagement. It tells them you aren't clinging or chasing or panicking in the empty spaces. It tells them you're not a threat to their independence. And that's when the shift happens. Suddenly, they're the ones restarting the conversation. They're the ones sending the first message. They're the ones reopening the door. They gently close, not because they feel guilty, not because they feel pressured, but because the silence they expected to suffocate the connection didn't. You didn't punish them for needing space. You didn't make them pay for breathing room. And that alone removes their biggest trigger, the fear of being engulfed. When you don't fill an avoidance silence with pressure, you create the exact condition that makes them come back with intention, warmth, and an openness they rarely show. You didn't chase them, and that's why they return. Avoidants are used to only two types of reactions: when conflict, distance, or misalignment shows up, explosion or anxiety. They expect the blow, the accusations, the emotional outbursts, the how could you disappear like that. They also expect the panic, the spiraling messages, the desperation, the fear-soaked pleas for closeness. Their past has trained them to assume that any boundary, any pause, any moment of pulling back will trigger emotional chaos from the other person. So when you don't react with fire or fear, when you choose calm instead of crisis, it disarms something deep inside them. It challenges their entire blueprint of how relationships work. It shocks their nervous system in a way that feels foreign but strangely comforting. Because your boundaries aren't sharpened weapons. They're not punishments. They're not hidden ultimatums wrapped in soft words. They're simply steady truths spoken clearly, respectfully, without the heat of drama. You don't yell, you don't guilt trip, you don't threaten to walk away. You just express what you need with a calm firmness that says you value yourself enough to stand on solid ground. And for an avoidant, that's powerful. It tells them they're not trapped. It tells them they're not being emotionally cornered. It tells them the connection can survive honesty without spiraling into chaos. Your calm boundaries communicate something avoidants rarely hear. I'm not here to take from you. I'm here as a choice. Those words, that energy land in the deepest part of them. Avoidants don't fear love. They fear obligation. They fear being consumed. They fear becoming responsible for someone else's emotional survival. So when you show them that you are capable of self-regulation, of expressing needs without drama, of maintaining emotional stability, even when things feel uncertain, it builds trust in a way nothing else can. Choice is the one thing an avoidant respects more than anything. They need to feel that love is freely given, freely received, never demanded. And when you demonstrate that your boundaries are not weapons, but invitations, not attempts to control them, but attempts to protect yourself, something shifts. They begin to see you differently. They begin to respect you. And when an avoidant respects you, they move toward you. It starts slowly. They initiate conversations without being prompted. They clarify things before misunderstandings can grow. They show up with more consistency because your steadiness makes them feel safe enough to be steady too. Your boundaries don't push them away. They anchor them. They give the relationship structure without suffocation. They show that you care, not by clinging, but by holding yourself with dignity. And here's the secret. Most people never realize avoidants are drawn to people who can hold boundaries without turning them into battles. It tells them you're emotionally mature. It tells them you're safe. It tells them you won't collapse under the weight of your own insecurities. And that safety is what makes them take the lead, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but out of genuine respect. Your calm becomes the space where their defenses finally lower. And in that space, they initiate. Avoidants don't run from love the way people assume. They run from speed, from the feeling that something is unfolding too quickly for them to emotionally process. It's the acceleration that terrifies them, not the connection itself. They fear being swept into something they didn't choose, something that grows faster than their nervous system can handle. So when someone pushes for labels, for immediate clarity, for commitments that feel premature, the avoidant instinctively recoils. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel everything all at once and don't know how to manage the intensity. That's why your approach is different. You don't rush them. You don't pressure their timeline. You don't suffocate the connection with expectations. It's not ready to hold. Instead, you let things unfold naturally. And that simple act becomes the safest thing they've experienced in a long time. You're not trying to drag the relationship into a future they aren't emotionally ready for. You're not asking them to define the bond before they even understand their own feelings. You're not demanding immediate closeness or rapid vulnerability. You give them space to breathe, to think, to grow into the connection instead of being shoved into it. And that lack of urgency is what begins to relax their entire system. For the first time, they don't feel like they're on a countdown. They don't feel like your affection comes with invisible deadlines. They don't feel like they have to race towards something just to keep you from feeling insecure. You allow the relationship to evolve at a pace that feels natural, and natural is exactly what an avoidant needs in order to stay connected. When you don't force labels, they start thinking about labels on their own. When you don't rush emotional closeness, they begin offering pieces of themselves voluntarily. When you don't push for commitment, they begin imagining what commitment might look like with you, not as a burden, but as a possibility. They're slowly warming to. The more you remove pressure, the more they find themselves leaning in without realizing it. Your patience becomes the antidote to their fear. Your steadiness becomes the anchor they didn't know they craved. Because deep down, avoidants don't want to run. They want a connection where their autonomy isn't threatened. They want a partner who understands that slow isn't a lack of interest, it's a form of safety. They want a relationship that grows like a sunrise, gradually, gently, consistently. And that's exactly what you give them. You show them that you're not trying to control the pace, and that single truth allows them to stay emotionally present without feeling trapped. And that's when the magic happens. Once they realize the relationship will move forward at the rhythm they feel safe in, they naturally begin taking the lead. They start initiating deeper conversations. They start planning time together. They start leaning into vulnerability without being pushed toward it. Because now the connection isn't something happening to them, it's something happening with them. And that's when an avoidant steps forward. Not when you chase, not when you pressure, but when you slow everything down enough for their heart to catch up. Avoidants shut down the moment they feel analyzed. The second someone starts dissecting their behavior, labeling their patterns, or turning their coping mechanisms into a psychological checklist, something inside them closes. They've spent their whole life being misunderstood, called cold, distant, confusing, unpredictable. So when someone treats them like a case study instead of a human being, every emotional door slams shut. It's not that they don't want connection, it's that they don't want to be turned into a project. But when you approach them differently, when you understand them with empathy, not judgment, it creates a rare emotional opening they don't experience often. You don't psychoanalyze them. You don't hold their defenses against them. You don't weaponize their past or throw their patterns back at them as flaws. Instead, you see the person underneath the armor. You talk to them, not at them. You listen, not interrogate. You interpret their distance not as rejection, but as fear. And something in that soft understanding whispers to them, you're not too much, you're not too distant, you're just human. For an avoidant, that message is revolutionary. They're used to being told they're impossible to love or impossible to get close to, so the moment someone treats their emotional style with compassion instead of criticism, their nervous system unravels in the best way. They feel something unfamiliar, something they almost don't trust at first: acceptance, not forced closeness. Not analysis disguised as care, genuine acceptance. And for the first time, they feel seen in a way that invites connection instead of retreat. Understanding is what melts their emotional armor, not pressure, not intensity, not someone trying to fix them. Your empathy gives them a sense of safety that makes vulnerability feel less like a threat and more like a choice. It tells them, I don't have to perform here, I don't have to hide, I don't have to defend myself. That alone is enough to pull them closer. Because deep down, avoidants crave being understood more than anything. They want someone who recognizes that their distance is a shield, not a lack of feeling. Someone who understands that their silence doesn't mean they don't care. It means they're overwhelmed. Someone who sees the tenderness behind their hesitation. And you seeing them that way, without judgment, becomes the emotional warmth they never knew they could trust. That's when they begin to open up, not with forced vulnerability or dramatic confessions, but with the quiet, unhurried honesty they reserve for the rare few who make them feel safe. They start initiating deeper conversations, the kind they never have with anyone else, the kind where their guard lowers, their thoughts spill out, and their emotions surface in soft, unpolished truths. Those conversations become their way of saying, "You're different, you're safe, you understand me." And once an avoidant feels understood, they no longer hide, they lean in, they stay present, they initiate. Not because they're suddenly free of their fears, but because for the first time, someone made those fears feel human, not shameful. Pulling away isn't rejection for an avoidant, it's regulation. It's the only way they know to steady their nervous system when emotions start moving too fast or too close. Most people take that distance personally and react with panic, anger, coldness, or accusations. And to an avoidant, those reactions confirm their deepest fear. Getting close always ends in overwhelm, but you don't punish their space. You don't weaponize silence. You don't treat their coping mechanism like a personal attack. Instead, you remain grounded, steady, and emotionally neutral. You don't demand explanations or guilt trip them for needing breathing room. You don't chase them into a corner or retaliate by disappearing out of spite. You simply hold steady, not closing the door, not standing in their doorway, just staying present without pressure. And that neutrality is exactly what flips the script. Avoidants aren't used to space being met with warmth. They're used to it being met with chaos. So when they pull back and nothing explodes, when you stay consistent instead of punishing, something shifts inside them. A quiet, rare thought emerges. I can come back to this person. They won't make it a war. That thought alone changes everything. Avoidants don't fear closeness as much as they fear the emotional expectations that come after closeness, the pressure, intensity, and demands they don't know how to sustain. But when you show them that their space won't cost them your connection, you remove the biggest barrier between you and them. You show them your connection doesn't depend on constant proximity. Your value isn't tied to their immediate availability. Your stability isn't threatened by their fluctuations, and your self-worth isn't shaken by their temporary distance. You become the rare person they can retreat from and return to without consequences. That's what breaks their lifelong cycle. Because the moment an avoidant realizes they can step back without losing you, they finally feel safe enough to step forward slowly, intentionally, and genuinely. Not because they're afraid to lose you, not because you demanded closeness, not because they feel obligated, but because your grounded energy makes closeness feel possible instead of dangerous. You become the safe harbor they choose, not the storm they run from. And that's when the runner becomes the leader. When the avoidant stops managing distance and begins initiating connection, not from fear, not from pressure, but from the one thing their nervous system needs most: trust. Avoidants don't hold back because they don't want to connect. They hold back because connection feels costly. Every step toward closeness feels like a step toward potential loss, potential suffocation, potential expectations they won't know how to meet. They don't initiate because they lack interest. They hesitate because they fear that getting close will slowly pull them out of themselves. So they stay guarded, controlled, measured. They watch you carefully, quietly, trying to understand if moving toward you will mean giving up their emotional freedom. But everything changes when your presence feels safe instead of demanding. When your energy is peaceful, warm, stable, something inside them softens in a way even they don't fully understand. You're not asking for more than they can give. You're not pulling them into emotional depths before they're ready to swim. You're not sending anxious signals that say, "Prove you care," or "Show me more," or "Save me from my insecurity." You're simply being there, steady and genuine, without trying to force intimacy or speed up the natural rhythm of the connection. And for an avoidant, that kind of presence feels like shelter. It feels like air. It feels like safety in a world where relationships have often felt like pressure. Your warmth isn't loud, it isn't overwhelming. It has a quiet, grounding quality that tells them you're allowed to take your time here. And that message is exactly what their nervous system needs in order to relax. When they sit with you, something inside them finally stops bracing for impact. They stop waiting for the emotional demands they've been conditioned to expect. They stop preparing to defend themselves or pull away. They feel peace, not because you're distant, but because your energy doesn't chase, your presence doesn't demand, your connection doesn't suffocate. And in that space of emotional calm, something shifts. They begin wanting to reach out first, not because they feel obligated or guilted into doing so, but because the connection feels safe enough for their own desire to surface. They find themselves thinking about you more gently, more openly, more willingly. They want to check on you, to see how your day is going, to reconnect after a moment of silence. It doesn't feel like a chore, it feels like a natural, almost instinctive. This is the part of avoidance most people never see. When they feel emotionally safe, they aren't distant at all. They're thoughtful, loyal, attentive in subtle but meaningful ways. They initiate plans, even if they keep them simple and low pressure. They make small gestures that reveal a deeper sincerity. They start imagining what building something with you would look like, not as a loss of freedom, but as a quiet addition to their life that feels grounding instead of consuming. They don't rush. They don't leap. They don't suddenly transform into someone hyper affectionate, but they become consistent. They show up. They stay connected. They take responsibility for the emotional thread between you instead of leaving it entirely in your hands. That shift is huge for them, a sign that their fear is lowering and their trust is rising. Because avoidants don't initiate when they feel pressure, they initiate when they feel peace. They move toward the person whose presence feels like home. Not a home that demands, but a home that welcomes, a home where they can be themselves without being overwhelmed, where they can take their time without being chased, where they can open slowly without being pushed. When your presence feels safe, not demanding, they don't just stay, they step forward. They lead, slowly, quietly, sincerely. Avoidants don't take the lead when they feel chased. They take the lead when they feel free. Freedom is the oxygen their nervous system survives on. Chasing feels like confinement. Pressure feels like a trap. Needing them feels like a demand they can never fully meet. So when an avoidant finally initiates, it's never random, and it's never because they suddenly became secure. It's because something in the dynamic shifted quietly, profoundly, unmistakably. They didn't feel hunted. They didn't feel expected to perform. They didn't feel like your attention would collapse if they stepped back for a moment. Pass. They felt space. And in that space, something they've spent their entire life running from slowly starts to grow. Desire. Not impulsive desire. Not the kind they feel during the honeymoon phase, but the slow, grounded desire that comes from deep safety, the kind they rarely experience with anyone. That's when the internal narrative changes. Instead, don't get too close. It becomes, I kind of want to reach out. Instead of, they might depend on me too much. It becomes, they're strong on their own, and that makes me feel safe around them. Instead of, if I initiate, I'll lose control. It becomes, if I initiate, nothing bad happens. They just respond warmly. To an avoidant, this shift is monumental. Because close connection has always felt like walking into a room where the walls slowly tighten. But with you, the walls don't close. They open. They realize reaching out doesn't cost them their independence. It doesn't make them responsible for your emotions. It doesn't trap them in someone else's expectations. It just feels good. And that good is new territory for them. So when they initiate, understand how significant it truly is. It's not out of need. Avoidants don't chase from fear. They don't pursue from anxiety. They don't reach out because they're scared to lose you. That's not their wiring. They reach out because of something rare. They feel safe enough to move toward you instead of away.
Safe enough to text first.
Safe enough to ask the next question. They safe enough to share something personal. Safe enough to plan ahead, even if they've avoided that their whole life. When an avoidant takes the lead, it means their nervous system trusts you. Their guard trusts you. Their past filled with emotional overwhelm, inconsistency, and pressure trusts you. You didn't force closeness. You didn't demand reassurance. You didn't chase them into a corner. You created an environment where connection wasn't a threat, it was an option. And when connection becomes an option, not an obligation, that's when the avoidant chooses it. That's when they choose you.